Hello and welcome to Politics at Jack and Sam's, the podcast that usually gives you everything you need to know about the day ahead in British politics, but not this time.
Not today, because it is the festive season. Westminster is on holiday, and so Sam and I are looking ahead to 2025 already. The countdown to next year has begun. Think of this as a special edition of this show, looking ahead to the year ahead in politics.
As ever, he is Jack Blanchard of Politico. I am Sam Coates of Sky News, and we're going to kick off with this guy.
Our first big test of fire comes on the first Thursday in May next year. We're going to need over 2,000 candidates. We're going to need you organised behind them, helping them. I genuinely believe if we get next May right, we can produce a result that is truly astonishing.
Are we going to see a lot of Nigel Farage in 2025? I mean, the answer's got to be yes, hasn't it?
We always see a lot of Nigel Farage in every year, and it would be remiss of us to suggest otherwise. Farage has dominated the conversation in Westminster for the last few months of 2024, frankly in an outsized way compared to the number of seats Reform UK have in Parliament, which of course is not very many. And there's a couple of reasons.
5.
Yes, exactly. It's a tiny number compared to the Tories and Labour. But if you look at the opinion polls, they are punching way above that weight. They are looking in the same sort of numbers as Labour and the Tories, and that means Nigel Farage is very much in the conversation for 2025. He believes he can use this little foothold he finally has in Parliament after all those years of trying to get in, him and his pals, as a springboard to try and do something much bigger in British politics over the next few years, in the way that we've seen sort of populist right-wing parties do across Europe and the Americas over recent years.
I'm really struck why Nigel Farage and Reform have done quite well over the last few months, because you do have populists who come into Parliament and you don't really hear very much of them after that. And I thought it was particularly true in 2024 of George Galloway. Big, noisy campaign to get into Parliament, but then, frankly, up until the point of the general election, you didn't hear a lot from him. But Farage and Reform have kind of worked out their game plan for how they grab attention. And just look at the sheer numbers of different issues that they jump on the back of. And I was going through some of the issues that they tried to own. It's everything from the Chinese spy scandal just before Christmas. Richard Tice was threatened to name the Chinese spy in the House of Commons. That's not a typical Reform issue by any stretch of the imagination. Nigel Farage grabbed the agenda soon after being elected with the riots and the two-tier Keir accusation about different levels of justice and policing when it comes to the treatment of people who were involved in all of that. And even it was the way that they jumped on the back of Kemi Badenoch's comments about, sandwiches and, eating steak, the silly stuff. But they've worked out that sort of aping the sort of TV host approach really works well for them. And whether it's on traditional TV channels, platforms, dare I say, like this one, or their own sort of self-generated content, what they do is they work out punchy lines and bind it together with a lot of humour, and that sort of carries further. Because, if we're being honest, Reform have punched far further than, for instance, the Liberal Democrats, who got more or less the same proportion of the vote, way more MPs, but we just hear a lot less from them. Why do you think that is?
Well, the Liberal Dems aren't polling, plus 20% and chomping at the heels of the two big parties in the way that Reform are. That's one reason. But there are other reasons too. There are big structural reasons why we're going to hear a lot more from Reform in 2025 and why I suspect they'll do quite well. They've obviously made immigration, and particularly illegal immigration, their top issue. If people who really feel passionate about that above everything else are more likely to vote Reform than anyone else. And the fact is, even though Keir Starmer has come in on a promise to reduce illegal migration massively, to smash the gangs that helping people cross the channel and so on, no one is really expecting that to deliver results quickly. And so I'm sure that through 2025 we will see another wave of migration, and Nigel Farage will make sure he is in a position to reap the political benefits of that.
But the Lib Dems got the same proportion of vote in the general election. They've got 72 MPs. Should we just be putting them all on telly a bit more? I mean, are we the problem here?
I mean, definitely the Lib Dems would say so, and I definitely think that they need to figure out what they are for now that they're in Parliament in such a big block, and what they actually want to try and achieve there. And I do think, Sam, talking about 2025, the local elections coming up in May, that'll be Keir Starmer's first big electoral test since winning the general election. It's much more likely to be Lib Dems that we see doing well there at Labour's expense, rather than Reform, who are still trying to figure out how to be a sort of big grassroots party across the country.
The current political situation reminds me about one aspect of the early Brexit years, when you had Theresa May's Tory government trying to look like the grown-ups, and then you had all these disruptors, largely from the right, but some of them from the left, coming in, and all they had to do was generate attention, sort of catch the sort of tail of a news story and leap into the headlines. And in the end, that ended up really doing for Theresa May's government. And I think it's interesting whether or not that approach at the moment, with kind of whether or not the people in the centre of British politics can escape the brand of soggy centrist and actually look like they're seizing control of the agenda and inspiring people.
Exactly. The people are looking for outsider parties. They're looking for people to hit the incumbents. And of course, it wasn't that long ago that the Lib Dems were in power. Nigel Farage Reform, they've never been in power, so that gives them an advantage there. And there's one more big structural reason, Sam, why it's good news for Reform next year, and he's called Donald Trump, who will be able to amplify Nigel Farage's message once he comes into the White House in January the 20th. We know they're close friends, so that will help Nigel Farage get even more prominence and even more media time than before. Let's talk about Donald Trump as we're looking ahead to 2025. Sam, the question I pose for you is, given the scale of what's coming in America, is he actually the only story that matters next year?
I mean, if not quite the only story, but close to the main thing, one of the main things we're going to be watching. I was just making a list in my head of all the reasons why there's a direct read across to from what's going on in the White House to what happens over here. Reading some of the analysis of the UK economy, the biggest uncertainty for the UK economy in 2025 is what Donald Trump is going to do with tariffs and the impact that that's going to have on the economy, and whether or not the 60 billion that we manufacture that goes to America at the moment, whether that's going to have taxes slapped on that. The second biggest thing that's going to affect people's lives is the path of inflation, and that is dictated by what happens in the Middle East and Ukraine, which is probably in large part going to be determined by Donald Trump.
We were both covering British politics for the first Trump presidency, and what's so memorable, Sam, is just how he sort of overshadowed everything. Every day the news cycle would just be blown up by Donald Trump tweeting something or saying something that you would just never have expected the leader of the free world to come out with, and I think we can expect to see that happening again. And
let me give you one example. Imagine Keir Starmer is negotiating a deal with the EU, as he says he wants to do, and then one day Donald Trump decides that he doesn't like it, and he starts tweeting about it, speaking about it. He says that the UK is making the wrong decision. It's hitching itself to EU standards. The EU is a bad thing. Keir Starmer couldn't do it. Do we think that deal would then survive? It's that kind of thing that we're talking about.
And that sort of thing is exactly right, was what plagued Theresa May throughout her premiership. She was trying to do these Brexit deals, and she had Donald Trump in the White House as the sort of commentator-in-chief, just throwing out unhelpful comments, saying how it'd be much better if Boris Johnson was leading it or Nigel Farage was leading it. And you could see the Downing Street sort of banging their head against the wall, trying to get this thing done. I think Keir Starmer will largely ignore that sort of thing. They'll find a form of words in Downing Street where they can just sort of wave away what the President of the United States has said this time. But it's incredibly unhelpful. And then, of course, there's all sorts of other unknowns about how Keir Starmer and Donald Trump interact on a personal level. So far, they seem to have got on okay, but there'll be a Starmer trip to meet him at the White House early in the new year, I'm sure. What if there's a dramatic falling out? You could see it happening. What if Trump does something to sort of humiliate Keir Starmer at a press conference? It's the sort of thing he does. He was taking the mickey out of Justin Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister, just the other day. How will Starmer react? All of that are things that the British government are going to have to navigate in 2025.
And I think there's one other area in which Keir Starmer is actually aligned with Kemi Badenoch, which is on this business of stopping reform. Now, Kemi went over to the US a few weeks before Christmas to meet with Republicans and with J.D. Vance, the soon-to-be vice president. And although she didn't meet Donald Trump there, the team that came back, the quite large entourage that I'm told was there and came back saying that in parts of Team Trump, they feel that Nigel Farage is overstating relations with the Republicans, and that there is a role for the Tories to link up again with the Republicans and with Donald Trump's White House. And they are very, very keen to do that because it is quite important, I would say, that Kemi Badenoch stops essentially Donald Trump endorsing everything that Nigel Farage does for the sake of her leadership of the Conservative Party and for the sake of stopping reform suddenly becoming the popular centre of in British politics.
There you go. So we're going to have this unseemly squabble of British politicians all trying to be Donald Trump's best friend in 2025. Can you think of anything worse?
Well, that feels like a good place to take a break. We'll have more predictions after this. Welcome back to Politics at Jack and Sam's, the podcast that gives you a flavour of what it's going to be like in 2025.
The OBR forecast that real GDP growth will be 1.1% in 2024, 2.0% in 2025, 1.8% in 2026, 1.5% in 2027, 1.5% in 2028, and 1.6% in 2029. And the OBR are clear. This budget will permanently increase the supply capacity of the economy, boosting long-term growth.
Pretty mediocre growth figures, whatever way you cut it there, from Rachel Reeves in the budget. But Jack, has it got worse, and is it going to get even worse in 2025?
It's hard to be super excited about the British economy in 2025, and you heard the numbers there from Rachel Reeves. Pretty bleak listening. There are certainly headwinds that suggest it could get worse. We talked about Donald Trump before the break. If he goes big on trade tariffs, if Britain gets caught in the crossfire of a trade war, that is going to have a very serious impact on the UK economy as well as on the global economy. That is one of the big risks to the UK economy. But even without that, it's hard to see how this sort of gangbusters growth that Reeves and Starmer were talking about before the election is actually going to happen. Certainly this year, given the extra taxes they've put on business, and given that some of the sort of structural reforms they're talking about, planning reform and so on, are all a long way off. So there certainly won't be lots of money to spend. And of course, one of the big pivotal political moments, Sam, of 2025 will be the spending review next summer, when Rachel Reeves will set out departmental spending levels for the rest of this Parliament. There is going to be an almighty scramble within Whitehall for cash because all the public services are squeezed. We've seen there isn't loads of money coming down the track in years to come, and somewhere she's going to have to make those numbers add up without another round of big tax rises, which she has said she's not planning to do.
It seems very, very choppy in the weeks and months ahead, certainly for the first 6 months of 2025. Look, at the back end of 2024, you had a series of really quite disappointing growth data and growth forecasts. A couple of the monthly GDP figures showed contractions, so the economy actually getting smaller. But the thing is, Jack, that monthly data all predated the budget. So you can expect, actually, this trend to continue, and actually there to be even tougher, even nastier figures coming down the track. Corporate confidence is down. What they're known as PMI surveys, that where basically sort of corporate finance managers have to say whether or not they're investing or not and buying or not. They're all in the negative as well. So I think the start of 2025 is going to be quite bumpy. And this matters for not one, but two different really tricky moments. Now, there's not going to be a kind of budget in the autumn. She's been very clear about that. But there is going to be another one of those big reports by the Office of Budget Responsibility, which essentially matters because at that point she gets judged. Her homework gets marked, and it gets marked by the OBR, who will determine whether or not she's met her fiscal rules. And the thing is, she left very little headroom, very little wiggle room against her sort of self-imposed fiscal rules at the budget in the autumn, and things have got worse. So there is a chance that when that event comes along on March the 26th, which is the date that they've put in for that she's actually having to find more money. And she said she's not going to borrow, and she said she's not going to tax, she's because it's not a budget. She's not going to do either of those. So even then, she might have to signal that she's going to squeeze spending even more because the economy is getting worse. All of that ahead of the probably early June spending review that we're heading to, which is looking like a really nasty bun fight inside Whitehall.
Absolutely. And even though they've injected money into the NHS initially, there are further years coming where the NHS, I'm sure, would like further funds. And it's not just the NHS. You know, they've been promising to squeeze on welfare, but how is that actually going to be happening? We haven't actually seen any of the details. Look at the problems in prisons. Solving that will cost money. Look at the problems in transport. Solving that will cost money. This is money that Rachel Reeves doesn't appear to have. And yet this is a government which has made big promises about fixing the public services, about getting Britain back on a sustainable footing and all the rest of it. And suddenly the next election won't start to feel so far away come the middle of 2025. And if there's no improvement in any of these areas, and frankly, I don't think there will be because it takes time to turn around some of these public services as well as investment, there will be some pretty panicky people inside Labour wondering where is the growth coming from? Where is the public service improvement coming from? And frankly, is Keir Starmer really up to the job of delivering the big promises we made before the election?
He is safe, right? You do think that Keir Starmer will fight the next election?
I mean, that's a long way away. And look what happened to the Tory party since it last won a big election in 2019. You know, you never would have dreamed 6 months after the 2019 election that Boris Johnson might not be safe. But here we are a few years later, however many Tory prime ministers later. So look, anything is possible in politics these days. There are people around the Labour Party who think Keir Starmer is not literally the best figure within the cabinet to be leading the party. So who knows? It feels completely impossible now, and I think the chances are he probably will be leading them into the next election. But it's hard to see how the path to sunlit uplands can be found at the moment.
I found how Rachel Reeves did and has done as Chancellor. I found that she's had a much, much trickier time than I was expecting. Some things, such as the winter fuel payments and some of the changes in direction and some of the accusations that she's done U-turns, actually, I think in other political circumstances might mean that some people would put her in the sort of in the exit airlock as Chancellor. And I think it has been, her performance has surprised on the downside quite a lot of people around. However, Keir Starmer has absolutely backed her all the way to the hill, all the way through. So I wouldn't expect her to go anywhere unless there's a massive crisis. But there are worries around how she's been doing. So 2025 needs to be the year that she is seen to turn things around after what has not been the greatest of starts.
It's not impossible that if we get further down the track towards an election, I'm certainly not talking about 2025, but maybe 2028, for example, if Labour are miles behind in the polls, if they didn't get the growth they promised, if public services haven't improved, if Labour are like polling third, which is not impossible, going with a year out or 18 months out from an election, there will undoubtedly be people within the Labour Party saying, thanks, Keir, you did a wonderful job at saving the party and getting us back in power. Maybe you're not the right guy to take it forward from here. I don't say that will happen, but it's possible. The other leader we should probably talk about before we finish, Sam, is the leader of the opposition, Kemi Badenoch. My question for you is, as we're, 6 weeks into her leadership, is she already toast?
Not yet, but I am surprised by some of the grumbling around the Conservative Party and some of the things that I'm hearing even from members of her own front bench. Here you've got somebody who knows how to generate a row, create a stink, set the agenda at points, but has come into the job of Tory leader. And what surprised some people, I think, is that she has been lower key and had perhaps a quieter, less prosaic, less dramatic start than they had been expecting. And there is a little bit of grumbling that she hasn't done more to reach out. There's a little bit of grumbling that everything is parked into reviews, meaning that they don't really have any policy as a party beyond a promise to reverse the inheritance tax changes in the budget for farmers. And there's just a bit of nervousness that the party isn't galloping on at the pace it should be, given what they think of as the troubles of the government.
The two most successful leaders of the opposition of the 21st century in British politics, Sam, have been David Cameron and Keir Starmer. They're the only ones that turned it around and actually got into government. If you'd have asked how were they doing a couple of months into their premierships, are they on track to win the next election? I think the answer probably would have been no. I don't think either of them are likely to win the next election at that point. It certainly took a couple of years down the track before you could suddenly see, actually, Keir Starmer might well be Prime Minister here. Actually, David Cameron, who, don't forget, was about to get turfed out by his party before the whole inheritance tax and Gordon Brown not calling the election thing, it took a while for them to bed in and for us to see that they really were the real deal. And so I think it's pretty early to be jumping to any conclusions about Kemi Badenoch. But she does face this threat from Nigel Farage that previous leaders of the opposition have not had to worry about a third party coming up on the other side and potentially overtaking them in the polls. If that happens and Reform are consistently polling ahead of the Tories in 2025, then she is going to come under a lot of pressure very quickly to do something about that.
I was messaging somebody in the Tories, outwardly a supporter of Kemi Badenoch, it has to be said, what they thought of her opening few weeks. And they pointed out that whilst things are, it's very early days, Robert Jenrick is speaking still to a lot of associations, just making sure he's keeping that warm. And they said this is quite a big contrast with Kemi Badenoch, who is not doing a lot either with the party in the country or, they say, with MPs. And if her kind of Achilles heel is, picking random fights and not reaching out to colleagues, it doesn't sound like she has particularly gone out of her way to change that or reassure people since she's come into power.
She's never going to change. Kemi Badenoch is Kemi Badenoch, for better or for worse. She's got lots of very strong attributes and certain things that people don't like about her, and whatever else she's going to be, she'll keep being Kemi Badenoch in 2025.
Well, that's all we've got time for. Thank you for joining us for one last time in 2024. This podcast will be back in January in the new year when you can find out whether we got the predictions right.
And you can find us wherever you normally get your podcast. Just search for Politics at Jack and Sam's in your podcast app or scan the QR code that's on your TV right now.